The Debrief is a production of faculty at the National Security Affairs Department at the U.S. Naval War College. The views presented here are those of the speakers and do not represent the positions of the Department of Defense or any of its components. Welcome to the Debrief, where we deconstruct defense, diplomacy, and developments in national security affairs at the U.S. Naval War College. I'm your co-host, Theo Milanopoulos. The 2022 National Security Strategy identifies the People's Republic of China as the only competitor with both the intent and increasingly the diplomatic, military, economic, and technological means to reshape the international order. What is the nature of the threat that China poses, and how is the United States adapting to meet it? Here to help us answer these questions is Kathleen Walsh, Associate Professor of National Security Affairs and Director of the Asia-Pacific Studies Group at the U.S. Naval War College, and Brian Chao, Assistant Professor at the Naval War College and Associate of the University of Pennsylvania's Center for the Study of Contemporary China. Kate, Brian, welcome to the Debrief.
Thank you.
Kate, let's start with you. Could you provide us an overview of the nature of the challenge posed by China, and what are the main interests at stake for the United States in the Indo-Pacific and in other regions more globally?
Sure. Let me answer your question in some academic way, saying first, what hasn't changed? Fundamentally, China remains the same as it has been since 1949, still a communist-led state, still in competition with the United States. And therefore, the U.S. strategy hasn't effectively changed. It's a hedging strategy against China, where we try to balance our interest in economic trade and investment with security interests. So that really hasn't changed. But what has changed, to your question, are, I think, three things. One, because of Xi Jinping, his focus and priority on ideological issues and reforms is something we haven't seen since the days of Mao. It's a revert to, in many ways, that approach to governing China. And it really undoes a lot of what the U.S. and the West has seen as opportunity in China, where Deng Xiaoping sort of came up with, in my view, a grand bargain with the West, and saying, and following China's own travails domestically with Mao Zedong and Gang of Four and all that, put modernization of ideology, check that box. We've done that. Let's move on to economic development and then technological and military modernization. And that allowed the opportunity for the U.S. and the West to increase relations with China, to invest in China. And so what fundamentally has changed is Xi Jinping is going back to ideology as a core interest, core concern for the PRC and its development and its role as a world leader. Secondly, along with that, China's revisionism. Xi Jinping, again, I think, unlike in many ways his predecessor, is seeking to not be part of the international world order as has been developed post-World War II, and the U.S. is an architect of that, but to revise the international world order along different values, principles, and ideas. And that is more threatening because it's not aligned with ours. And then finally, as we've seen more recently, the Sino-Russian relationship. It's not entirely an alliance, comprehensive strategic partnership with no limits. It's changing, it's expanding, but it's not entirely clear. But I think what is clear is the foundation of that is a return to a revanchist on the part of Russia, irredentist on the part of China, this idea that great powers have interests in territories that were once theirs and therefore should be theirs again. And I think that is the greatest threat to world peace in the Indo-Pacific and beyond, and that we're finding ways to reckon with now. So those more fundamental changes, I think, because of Xi Jinping, are what we're dealing with now.
And Brian, what are some of the common misconceptions that those practitioners who may not be as well versed in the study of China might carry with them when they're thinking about this problem?
So I think there are probably three big misconceptions at work here. The first is, and one you see very commonly in, for example, many trade books, is the idea that China is 10 feet tall. That China is a particularly clever, astute, omniscient, strategic player in international politics, and that is just running circles around the United States, which by implication is somehow incapable of being as strategic as China is. But if you just look at Chinese policy, both domestic and foreign, over just the last decade, you'll see that China's missteps are quite plentiful. China is just like any other country in this sense. It is an actor that is working with incomplete information, that cannot predict the future, and while it may certainly wish to shape the future, it does not have some sort of special skill or talent when it comes to conducting foreign policy. The second, I would say, big misconception is the idea that countries that have specific problems with China would automatically be on the U.S. side as some sort of broader hedging or anti-China strategy. Countries pursue their own interests. They are going to see, how the United States and China conduct their bilateral relationship. They're not interested in picking sides. They may, in fact, benefit from playing the two sides off each other. But the United States should bear in mind that other countries are going to pursue their own interests. So, for example, India may have serious issues with China, but that does not necessarily mean that India is going to be all on board with some anti-China U.S. strategy. And sort of a corollary to this is the idea that countries that want to oppose China with something simply lack the capacity or the capability, and that the United States just has to give the capacity or help, sell them the capability, and that they will be on side. So, for example, if you think about Southeast Asian countries dealing with Chinese fishing in their exclusive economic zones, this sort of line of thinking is, well, these Southeast Asian countries, they don't have the navies or coast guards to combat China. So if we can help them with their capacity, then they would, they would they would stand up to China in the way that, say, the United States has sort of been diplomatically and militarily doing so. But of course, these countries have their own interests. They will have different calculations at play. They may see, for example, the same illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing that the United States does. But they may conclude that they value the overall bilateral trade relationship with China, and they're not willing to make that an issue at this time. So I think those are the two main misconceptions at play today.
Now, Kate, you just to build on something that Brian mentioned about the relationship between states, I was struck by your association with the partnership that's brewing between China and Russia. And I was wondering, it brought me back to kind of thinking around the kinds of Sino-Soviet split that we saw during the Cold War. What do you think the prospects are for in the short term and kind of in the long term for that kind of reemergence of a wedge between those countries?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's certainly a strategy that some are advocating, that we try to put a wedge between China and Russia. But I think the way that's framed is problematic, because I don't think it's China and Russia. I think it's Putin and Xi, where really Xi is now the leader of this relationship. And I think what bonds them, what I've seen that bonds those two leaders, is this shared interest in reclaiming lost, if you will, territories. But that can change in both instances. So you have a change in leadership in both of these countries, you could have a very different relationship, and that trilateral, triangular relationship could change again, as it has in the past. So I think how that's framed is important. And I'm not sure we're going to change the minds of either President Putin or Xi Jinping. And so I think we might want to focus on other things, given those personalities.
Well, one potential flashpoint that is outside of that relationship is obviously one between Washington and Beijing over the status of Taiwan. And on this issue, the United States adheres to what's called the One China policy. I was wondering if you could help us understand what the One China policy is, which is a large question, and how it has evolved over successive presidential administrations and Congresses over time.
Sure. I'm laughing because it's not an easy question to answer for anyone. It's hazardous. I alert my students, Taiwan policy, red flag, because words matter, and particularly when trying to explain or share what it is vis-a-vis Taiwan, because it's very carefully crafted. And so when people mention the One China policy, they're generally referring to what U.S. strategy and policy is vis-a-vis the PRC and Taiwan back to the Nixon rapprochement with China, so back to 1972 when Nixon visited China. Some scholars would argue it predates that, but for common usage, that's what it refers to. And so the One China policy is the U.S. One China policy. It is not a One China policy that's shared with China, for instance. And it's not what China would call, the PRC, People's Republic of China, would call the One China principle, which is different, and I'll explain. So again, going back to 1972, Nixon visits China. The context of that matters in creating the One China policy, because China was still in the state of civil war, right? So 1949, the communists prevail. Mao Zedong establishes the People's Republic of China on the mainland, what we today call China, and the Kuomintang KMT moves to retreats to Taiwan. At the time, we recognized Taiwan as the sole legitimate government of China. But in the 1970s, there was a movement by the PRC and the non-aligned movement, and a lot of support in the UN General Assembly, where they were able to actually take the UN Security Council seat by votes in the UN General Assembly, and the U.S. wasn't able to stop that. So there was movement to recognize the PRC as China instead of Taiwan. And so the Nixon visit now, in context, that was the first opening to China. And that's the origin of what most people call now, today, the One China policy. And the status of Taiwan is key to that, and remains so today. So the U.S. One China policy is an acknowledgement that there is one China, but it's not an agreement with that, right? So it acknowledges that that's the position, or was the position of both sides at the time, that both Beijing and Taipei said, we're the government of China. We don't take a position on that. We just say that we acknowledge that it exists. And that's the difference between the U.S. One China policy and the PRC's One China principle, which says that Taiwan is a part of China. We acknowledge that they say that, we don't agree with it. At the same time, we established formal relations with the PRC in 1979 under the Carter administration, and then shifted to an unofficial relationship with Taiwan, which is governed by the American Institute in Taiwan on the U.S. side, and TECRA, the Taiwan Economic Cultural Representative Office, on the side of Taiwan, non-governmental organizations. So we maintain relationships with both governments. So again, very nuanced, balanced, and complicated. The basis, the context for the U.S. One China policy is actually based on 3 U.S.-China joint communiques. Those were signed by President Nixon in 1972, the Shanghai Communique, the Communique on Normalization signed by President Carter in 1978, and then another by President Reagan in 1982 on arms sales to Taiwan. So those 3 policies, U.S. PRC joint communiques, also governed by the law, the Taiwan Relations Act, passed in 1979. So President Carter formalizing our diplomatic relations with the PRC, shifting away from Taiwan, went to Congress and said, this is how we'd like to implement it. Congress said yes, and we'd like to add more to it, and passed the Taiwan Relations Act. So that's law governing the One China policy. And then in addition to all of this, each administration will often have its own documents or assurances or points to clarify what the U.S. policy is, or U.S. One China policy is. And the most prominent among those is President Reagan's 6 assurances, which is a complement. It's 6 assurances to Taiwan to complement the joint communique with the PRC on arms sales. So it's a long answer, I realize, but it matters, and words matter. And what the U.S. China policy is very nuanced, but of course, along the way, things have changed. Taiwan's now a democracy. The Cold War is over. China's military modernization has grown much faster than was predicted. And so where this gets even more complicated is in how to implement it, right? And interpretations may have changed over time, and how it's being implemented, and perceptions over time. And that's a worry often in Beijing and Taipei of how the U.S. is implementing its One China policy. And I'll just end with this, which is in terms of implementing it, the practical aspects where the rubber meets the road is, is it permissible or advisable to have the Speaker of the House visit Taiwan, as we saw with Speaker Pelosi most recently. The executive branch can't stop that. Congress is its own branch. But of course, how is that being interpreted by the U.S. government, by Beijing and Taipei? Whether we have military officers and presence in Taiwan, what kind of arms sales do we share with Taiwan, given the communique and the Taiwan Relations Act? Whether our Taiwan students here can wear the uniforms or not. So the practical aspects of all of this, is a problem for every administration. So I realize it's a long answer, but it's very complicated. And what One China policy means is in the U.S. context with all of this history.
But an important one to get right for those that are practitioners and scholars alike. Yes. Very easy to oversimplify and then miss some of the critical nuance. But to somewhat oversimplify, Brian, I was wondering if you could help us understand what several scholars and practitioners will often refer to as far as U.S. position on China, on Taiwan, as a posture of strategic ambiguity, right, over the United States' willingness to come to Taiwan's defense in the event of a Chinese attack. I was wondering, there are lots of scholars that are now calling for a shift away from strategic ambiguity towards one of strategic clarity. I was hoping if you could illuminate for us what strategic ambiguity is and what the risks and opportunities of shifting towards strategic clarity might offer in a shift in policy.
So, as Kate laid out, U.S. policy with regard to Taiwan has been very complex over the decades, but one major component has been the policy of strategic ambiguity. And the U.S. objective for the longest time has been that there be peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. And so strategic ambiguity is actually a sword with two edges. The edge that probably most people recognize is that it's meant to deter China from invading Taiwan. But what most people probably don't quite realize is that there was a second goal, which was to deter Taiwan from doing anything that would upset cross-strait peace and stability. So hence this policy of strategic ambiguity being that the United States would not state clearly what it would do in the event of a cross-strait conflict. So there are now those who are arguing for strategic clarity. Strictly speaking, strategic clarity is asking the United States to declare publicly that it will, in fact, intervene in a military conflict across the Taiwan Strait. Where the difficulty arises is that strategic clarity has now been taken by some policymakers and scholars advocating for a broader change in U.S. policy towards Taiwan, advocating, for example, diplomatic recognition of Taiwan, sort of full-throated U.S. government support for Taiwan's government against China. So that makes it more complex, because if you take strategic clarity as just sort of on its own, the U.S. will intervene in a cross-strait conflict to prevent China from forcibly reuniting Taiwan, you could come up with that stance and still say, but we don't take a position on, say, Taiwan's political status. Right? The point here is that Taiwan's status is resolved peacefully. We're only going to intervene if it becomes a violent one. But now many are taking that further and saying, well, no, the United States should want Taiwan to be independent, should prefer Taiwan be independent, and the strategic clarity part is part of this bigger change in U.S. strategy. So when you put that in, well, the opportunity and risk sort of calculus changes dramatically. Opportunities, well, being clear reduces the possibility of misperception and miscalculation. You can argue in a great power relationship, as Beijing and Washington have, particularly both being nuclear armed, that's a good thing, right? Each side understands where everybody else stands. You could also argue from a liberal international relations theory perspective that the United States ought to be doing this. Taiwan is a liberal democracy. It is probably one of the most successful examples of democratization since 1945. The United States has a moral imperative to stand up for Taiwan and support Taiwan so that Taiwan doesn't become like Ukraine, or doesn't become like any other democratic country that gets picked on or invaded by an autocracy. So definitely there are arguments that are made there. But then, of course, there are drawbacks, especially if you couch strategic clarity within the bigger U.S. policy change on Taiwan, which is that clarity may, in fact, raise the risk of the very war that you're trying to deter. This may be a red line that China views as simply unacceptable, and that regardless of whether the Chinese military is prepared for it or not, China may feel like it has no choice but to engage in military action. The second issue is that the United States committing to strategic clarity basically limits U.S. freedom of maneuver. The United States has now made a public commitment. Its credibility is now engaged. What happens then if China either calls the United States on it and actually launches a military attack? Or what happens if Taiwan interprets this as full-throated U.S. support and decides to formally declare independence? And Taipei is confident that since the U.S. will come to its aid, it's not too concerned about the predictable Chinese military response. So these are all issues that strategic clarity raises in terms of a shift in U.S. policy. And there are both pros and cons. There's a vociferous debate that's been ongoing for about 2-3 years now about that. That's sort of in a nutshell, sort of what the changes are and what the implications they would entail.
And Brian reminded me, I didn't actually state what the Biden administration would articulate as the U.S.-China policy today. And as Brian said, the U.S. One China policy today acknowledges the party's views that there is one China, doesn't take a position, but opposes any unilateral or non-peaceful means of changing the status quo, does not or does expect differences to be solved via peaceful means, and does not support Taiwan independence. So as you heard, that these are debated today, but that is the one China policy as articulated currently by the Biden administration.
So, Brian, can I follow up briefly on, given that it links back to what you were saying about states having their own agency outside the shadows of either of these two larger powers in the region, and specifically about Taiwan, right? I was struck by the metaphor of a double-edged sword restraining both sides of the strait. And I'm curious about how Taiwan's domestic political process or domestic political context has changed over time, especially in the more recent years, to lead to a kind of possible change in the way that the status quo is operating currently.
So there have been dramatic changes in Taiwan over the last few decades. And for me, the fundamental issue in Taiwan is one of national identity. And the fact that you do not have the overwhelming majority of the people of Taiwan agreeing on what exactly that identity is. And so you see that playing out in terms of cross-strait relations, but also in domestic politics writ large. Kate mentioned, the various facets of the U.S. position on the Taiwan issue. It used to be that the United States simply said that the two sides wanted to see the two sides resolve their political issues peacefully. Since Taiwan's democratization, the United States has actually come out and modified that and said it wants to see the cross-strait situation resolved peacefully and with the consent of the people of Taiwan. So it recognizes the fact that because of Taiwan's democratization, the people should have a say. Now, in terms of national identity, we've seen over the last few decades that the people of Taiwan have begun to see themselves as more Taiwanese as opposed to, say, Chinese. The latest surveys show that right now about 60% of survey respondents see themselves as solely Taiwanese. About 30% see themselves as both Taiwanese and Chinese. And the rest of the 10% is split into just Chinese or don't have a preference or don't care to give a response. That's a sea change from just 2 decades ago, let alone 3-4 decades ago. So as you see this stronger identity emerge, which is natural, given how people are, the generations succeed each other. People born and raised on Taiwan simply don't see mainland China in the way that their grandparents who escaped with Chiang Kai-shek would have. Right? This is natural. But as this goes along, well, there are a few implications to draw from this. For example, if you're looking at this from China's perspective, you're seeing more and more people on Taiwan, relatively speaking, not identifying with China, not identifying with the mainland, not having any sort of familial or sort of intimate relationship with the mainland. And that should make the idea of reunification even harder. It's going to look even less attractive because now those family bonds are essentially broken or simply too distant in time to really matter. What does that mean for how China views the possibility of unification? Is China going to decide, well, actually, the more time goes by, the fewer people on Taiwan will see themselves as Chinese. So do we need to put pressure and try to achieve unification as soon as possible? On the other hand, China might say, well, people of Taiwan might feel that way, but we know that the cross-strait balance is tipping in our favor year by year. So whatever they feel doesn't really matter. We have the military capacity to do what we want, and with each passing year, that military capacity will get stronger and stronger, barring any unforeseen change in U.S. posture and commitment. So it's sort of a tricky question for China in terms of looking at Taiwan and saying, well, what happens there? For the people of Taiwan, I think that as time goes by, you are going to see, just sort of due to natural change in generation, you're going to see more and more people identify themselves as Taiwanese. What's interesting right now is that while you see that change in identity, you see a largely stable preference for the political status quo. The people of Taiwan know that even though the identity is changing, if they choose to, say, declare independence, that's going to trigger potentially war, and even if it's not war, a lot of other things that China could do that would hit Taiwanese socioeconomic and Taiwanese society. And so even as you see a change towards a greater Taiwanese identity, you see a rock-solid majority in favor of maintaining of the status quo of the cross-strait, sort of a live and let live approach.
Now, Kate, you've indicated that that the leadership of China and the assertive leadership of President Xi has been at the core of some of the changes and these broader developments in the region. What is it that that distinguishes President Xi from his most immediate predecessors, both in his relations with the United States and other countries in the region? And then how has that shifted Washington's posture over the last decade?
Sure. We see the word assertive used. I think it's diplomatic and accurate in the sense that China is becoming more of a leading power in global affairs, and that is in many ways welcomed by the United States and the West. We have welcomed China into the WTO and into lots of different arrangements. And back in the, I guess the 90s, Bob Zoellick was famously known for, making or having China be more of a responsible stakeholder, right? So China being more assertive in its foreign policy and international leadership is something that's really expected as China has been growing and China's rise. And so that's happened, and it's not always fully welcomed, of course. It's not necessarily easy, but including China more and more in international affairs is something that's to be expected and has been occurring. I think with Xi Jinping, where things have changed is more aggressive, not assertive, but aggressive in a military or paramilitary way, where we see not just the Wolf War diplomacy on a diplomatic side of things, where using very coercive or harsh language and rhetoric that is not accustomed in diplomatic realms, but also taking military or paramilitary action in the South China Sea, in its military maneuvers around Taiwan, effectively blockading Taiwan in a threatening manner, and at sea or in the air, dangerous encounters with U.S. and other forces in the Indo-Pacific region, and so that not assertive, which I think is expected, but more aggressive actions on the part of China under Xi Jinping is what has led to change. And so I think that's affected U.S.-China relations in the sense that the U.S. has been long wary of China's more aggressive actions. But now other countries, I agree with Brian that we can't make other countries who have their own self-interest follow us entirely, but they have come more to our side of concern in seeing these Chinese more aggressive actions on their own and being the recipient of the Wolf Warrior diplomacy and the military or paramilitary actions, as the Philippines, for instance, are witnessing and experiencing today. And so even the European Union in 2019 called China a strategic rival. So, this new, much more assertive and aggressive form of international activity and leadership, revisionist leadership, trying to make Chinese-led, Chinese origin regimes, instead of being more of a player in the existing regimes, or trying to reform or amend those for China's interests, but setting up separate or parallel systems and regimes is viewed, increasingly as trying to upend the international order for China's interests in ways that are not necessarily in the interests of other states, the U.S. and others. And so I think that's where under Xi, we've seen a real sea change in terms of viewing China, and again, that hedging strategy leaning less towards economic and trade interests and more towards those security concerns, if you think of it as a spectrum or a balancing act. And so preserving those sovereignty and security interests are taking more precedence than they were in the past, and that's mainly due to Xi Jinping, I think.
Brian, what risks and opportunities does President Xi's leadership, both over the PRC and the Chinese Communist Party, present for Washington, both in the near term and in the long term?
Well, the biggest risk is, frankly, Xi himself. We've been here before. You see what happens when authoritarian leaders decide to assume all the decision-making powers, when they surround themselves with yes men, when they perhaps start to believe in the cult of personality that they are cultivating. Everything is now dependent on one person. And if you don't have, say, honest and open feedback loops, then you increase the possibility of miscalculation, of incomplete or just wrong information. Now, that can be both a good and a bad thing. If you look at the mistakes on which Kate pointed out that Chinese foreign policy has made that have resulted in pushback, Well, if Xi continues to make those, the United States has more than ample opportunities to ensure that its interests are met, that its allies and partners' interests are met, that the liberal international order that the United States created after 1945 is able to be sustained and isn't undermined or overthrown. On the other hand, you could have a China that engages in miscalculated behavior that could induce crises, up to and including war. And my biggest fear right now is, especially given the general lack of communication between China and the United States, that it would take something like a Cuban Missile Crisis to shock Beijing, Xi specifically, into realizing that maybe it's good to talk with Washington. Maybe shutting down communication is not such a good thing because you fail to understand, might not convince the other side, but you don't even know how the other side thinks or what it's thinking. So I think those are both near-term and long-term issues. Well, more near-term. She is approaching 70 years old. There's that just fact of life that we have to bear in mind. So it's probably more near-term than long-term. And one of the questions that we don't really have an answer for, we won't know for some time really, is how much of China's behavior in the past decade has really been because of Xi Jinping? How much of it is just any leader in China, given China's growth and resources and wealth, like would any leader of China have done virtually the same thing? And that's something that we won't, we can't run an experiment and see how it goes. But that we won't get the answer till after Xi is gone. In terms of is this a China that the United States has to deal with for the rest of the century, or was this a Xi Jinping thing? And we actually do have a brighter prospect in the future for better great power relationships.
The classic question that we often pose to our students about the role of structural factors or agents when it comes to these questions, always at the core. Kate, what advice or recommendations would you give to military officers, national security professionals who will be going on to roles and assignments either in the Indo-Pacific or elsewhere in the globe that are going to be operating and fulfilling responsibilities in the shadow of this strategic competition?
Sure. Well, one, as I mentioned, anytime you're talking about Taiwan, it's hazardous. Make sure you get it right. I mentioned, the One China policy is not the same as the One China principle. Also, as Brian referenced, the Taiwan Relations Act doesn't promise to defend Taiwan. It promises to provide a defense to Taiwan. The words matter. And so beware, right? Because if you simplify or you shorthand, it can change the understanding, and that's problematic. It's a complex relationship, as we've said, and nuances are important. Sound bites really don't work in this context. I mean, they rarely do, but in this one particularly. Related to that, there's a lot of, what's the right way to say this? Pejorative language when it comes to the analysis of China over decades, but it comes back periodically, and it sometimes infects the discussion, debate about what to do about China. And so when you hear or read phrases like panda hugger or panda slugger or commie or things like these, they're often common, but they're a good example of cognitive bias, really poisoning good, sound, strategic, and policy analysis, in my view. But it's real. And then just two more points. War with China is a failure if that happens. Of course, we have to be ready for it. We have to, be prepared if that happens. But I'm concerned that we don't have a real understanding or are publicizing or making clear exactly what that would look like, especially if you take into account the potential for nuclear escalation. And so I'd align with Brian, and I think one of the things that students and faculty, but students especially, look to those confidence and security building measures that we used effectively in the Cold War to do things like crisis management, arms control, other ways of not necessarily agreeing with the other side, but finding ways to at least understand, comprehend what they're thinking, and reduce the chances of conflict, particularly something of that scale. And then finally, similar also to Brian, change is a given, particularly with China, and we have to be ready for that. So today we're preparing for a Xi-led China, but as Brian says, it could change overnight. right? And I don't think we'll see it coming. 'Cause China's increasingly a closed society, not only with COVID, but before and since then, she has been closing, China to foreign understanding and access. And so I don't think we'll be prepared for it, but we have to be prepared for change, right? Because the next leader could be somebody much more pragmatic and less ideological than Xi Jinping is, somebody we could work with. And we want to be prepared for that as well. So the unknown in this situation, I think, is a real problem, but one that we have to factor in.
Well, regardless of any change in policy or strategy, I've certainly at least found this conversation clarifying. So thank you to you both for being here on the debrief.
Thank you.